This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Mark Williams, Professor and Chair of the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Recreation at the University of Utah. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Mark Williams. Mark recently moved to Utah after holding positions in the UK and Australia. He is a prolific researcher and writer, with the focus of his work being the neural and psychological mechanisms underpinning the acquisition and development of perceptual cognitive and perceptual motor skills. He is also the current editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sports Science. In the interview, we discuss designing effective practice, talent identification and development, and anticipation training. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show. Today
my guest is Mark Williams, Professor and Chair of the Department of Health, Kinesiology, and Recreation at the University of Utah. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Mark.
My pleasure.
To kick things off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into sports science?
Yeah, I guess my initial interest in sport came because, like many people, because I was quite active in sport. I was actually a schoolboy and a youth international soccer player back in the UK a long, long time ago. So that sparked my initial interest in sport. And then I guess, like many people, I was interested in going to university, didn't have a specific topic in mind. And so this was around the mid-1980s. And at that time, actually, sport and exercise science was just starting as an academic discipline in the UK. In fact, I actually ended up being I think I was the second year of graduates from a sport and exercise science degree in the UK in 1988. So I went down, did an undergraduate degree in sports science, and then did a PhD in the area of movement science or cognitive psychology.
Sports science must have evolved a lot since you first got into it.
Yes, I mean, it has markedly, of course. So, in fact, in the UK, Liverpool John Moores University, where I worked at for 17 years, and Loughborough University, where I believe the two initial universities to offer sport and exercise science as an undergraduate degree. But certainly in the UK, it's grown markedly and is now the most popular science-based undergraduate degree in the UK. And rightly or wrongly, more people do sports science as an undergraduate degree than physics and chemistry together, I'm afraid. It's become a very, very popular topic area amongst students. And of course, that's the whole field has mushroomed out. A lot of employment opportunities in high-performance sport as well.
The first specific topic I wanted to jump in and talk to you about is deliberate practice. And this has been getting attention a little bit I've seen lately. I don't know if you saw, I guess it was last week. I don't know if you've heard of the Dan Plan, Dan of the Dan Plan.
No, I didn't see that, actually.
So he was a golfer that was trying to become professional by doing 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. And he had a blog going. And I think it was kind of a big story because he gave up last week.
Oh, okay.
And this is, of course, gives lots of people opportunity to take a kick at deliberate practice and 10,000 hours. And obviously there's some limitations with drawing conclusions from that. But
yeah,
I just wanted to get in your mind, what is the value of deliberate practice and where do we need to go, deliberate practice theory, and where do we need to go from here to kind of advance it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the main plus points of deliberate practice is that it probably differentiates quite nicely between the mere passive accumulation of experience within a domain and the actual accumulation of specific deliberate practice with the intention of improving some aspects of performance. For me, I don't see the 10,000 hour rule as a rule per se. It's just a guideline. It just so happens that there are lots of domains where 10,000 hours of practice seems to be important in the development of expertise. There are other sports and domains where maybe fewer hours are important. I think perhaps the key issue is that we optimize and maximize the use of practice time. I guess the more interesting question is, to what extent or to what proportion of time should athletes spend on practice that maintains a level of performance on certain skills, and what proportion of that time should they spend on activity that actually develops new skills and that strengthens skills that are not so strong. So for me, I think the nice thing about deliberate practice is it puts the focus quite clearly on developing practice activities that are specifically designed and aimed to improve an aspect of performance so that the learner, if you like, continues his or her journey on that learning curve upwards.
I know a lot of people have started to talk about periodization of the psychological aspects of practice in the same way that we've done with physical practice for a long time. So I guess you could think about that in terms of there's a time and place for deliberate practice, probably not the day before a big match, right? You might not be wanting to work on real improvement. Maybe there's a time and place to schedule it, and times where you do want to do the maintenance.
Yeah, true. I mean, to some degree, there are parallels here with the differentiation between performance and learning in the model learning literature, isn't there? In the sense that, engaging in deliberate practice may not necessarily lead to good performance during practice sessions. Benefits of deliberate practice may come subsequent to that in regards to better retention and transferability of skill. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept. And again, we've done work where we've sort of identified groups of skilled and less skilled individuals. And what we've done is we've looked at the type of practice that they actually engaged in when allowed to self-regulate, i.e. to structure and organize practice on their own. And the conclusion that typically comes out is that less skilled individuals do spend the majority of their time practicing skills that they're already good at, whereas in contrast, the skilled individuals have, if you like, more of a growth mindset in that they do spend more of their time engaging in practicing skills that they're less good at. But yeah, it's an interesting debate around what should, be the relative distribution of practice time between maintenance and growth-related practice activities. And as you rightly suggested, that will probably vary from session to session in some kind of periodized manner, I would imagine.
Yeah, and I guess that leads me on to my next topic. I wanted to ask you about practice design. And I know you've done a lot of research on what makes for a good practice. And also, I know you do a lot of consulting directly with teams and athletes. So do you think there's a divide between the theory for what makes a good practice and what you actually see on the field in the regards to how we train athletes?
Yes, although on a positive sense, I would say that that's changing somewhat. But certainly historically, I think the dominant model has been a very prescriptive approach to the coaching process. Coaches have relied heavily on the provision of instruction and the use of demonstrations. There seems to have been a heavy reliance on blocked repetitive practice, as emphasized by drill and grid-based practices. And again, a strong emphasis on the provision of copious amounts of feedback. So I guess the philosophy there is that the coach possesses all the knowledge and that he or she will then bestow that knowledge to the learner through this very prescriptive type of approach. I mean, the research evidence, of course, suggests that whilst we know that that type of instruction seems to facilitate better performance during the actual practice sessions, the paradox here, in essence, is that better learning and retention stroke transfer conditions are actually promoted by a more hands-off approach to the instruction process. So I guess the philosophy that I always try and bestow in coaches, and I think one that is gaining much mileage at the moment, is to kind of look at it in the sense of, what is the least amount of instruction that I as a coach need to present the athletes? And then to what extent are my practice conditions dynamic and variable such that they reflect the demands of competition? And for me, specificity is key here. The practice environment has to at least match, and in some instances, overload or exceed the demands of competition. And then finally, what is the least amount of feedback that I as a coach need to give the athletes so that the athletes can learn to self-regulate and control their own practice condition. So, I mean, the research evidence suggests that the latter conditions there would better promote long-term learning, retention and transfer. I have seen, as you rightly pointed out, I do a lot of coach education related work, and I've certainly seen over the last decade or so increased awareness and understanding of this differentiation between performance and learning. And certainly many sports, a significant change in the way that coach behaviours are now carried out in the practice setting.
And I know in this regard, I've heard you use the term reversal phenomenon. And is that the juxtaposition between practice and learning you were talking about, or is that something different?
Yeah, no, I think it is really. And as someone who has a little bit of a coaching background myself, I do empathise with coaches. It's probably the hardest job in the world in many ways. And clearly as a coach, you need a great craft knowledge about the sport. But I guess my focus is always to try and improve the professional knowledge of the coaches. And the challenge for the coaches is that what you see or what they see is not necessarily what they get as far as learning is concerned. So you may be running a practice session which is very structured, very prescriptive, a lot of drill and grid-based practices, where it looks as if the athletes, the players are learning quite substantially. Whereas in contrast, and this is where I think the notion of a reversal phenomenon goes on, if you have a coaching session where there's perhaps limited amounts of instruction, it's a very dynamic and variable practice situation with high levels of specificity and limited feedback, then performance is not necessarily good in that particular practice session. But the reversal factor is that latter practice session may actually promote more learning, retention and transfer. So there's two issues here. That's the reversal concept, and this, I think, this notion as well that what you see is not always what you may feel you're getting as far as practice is concerned. And of course the challenge is that we can't directly observe learning. We have to infer that learning is taking place from changes in behavior over time. So the reason why looking at a particular practice session not necessarily indicative of learning is that clearly we need to have some measure of retention of that change in performance and some transferability of that, either from practice to competition or from one practice session to another novel version of that particular practice.
When you talk about overloading in practice, are you referring to manipulating constraints, like giving the athlete less space to work in or maybe less time to act than they would have in the real game?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff in the literature at the moment around the notion of manipulating constraints with the practice environment. And I'm a big supporter and a big fan of that. So I guess the challenge for coaches is just how can they manipulate the constraints within the learning environment in order to vary the workload the athletes are actually presented with. I mean, I often use an analogy actually, which I draw from physiology, because I guess in many ways I kind of refer to the notion that if I wanted to develop a bigger bicep, then, what are the key principles here? And clearly the first thing is there has to be some element of specificity to training in regards to the fact that, there's no point in me doing leg squats if I want to get a bigger bicep. I've got to do bicep curls or something close to that. Specificity is key. Then we've got overload. So I have to be able to use sufficient weight in the dumbbell to put some stress on the bicep. And element of repetition is important. And of course, we know that muscle fiber grows during rest and recovery through the process of supercompensation. And I think the same principles apply in the concept of learning, really. So the challenge for coaches is, if you think of learning as sort of neural networks firing in the brain, if you like, then at one level, the question would be, the neural networks that are being fired during practice, do they match those that would be fired during competition? So that's the specificity angle of it. And then secondly, there needs to be some overload. So, these neural networks in the brain, at some point, I've got to start panicking and think, I've got to do something about this. The stress is too high and I've got to create some kind of adaptations. So overload for me is key. And then clearly there needs to be some element of repetition, albeit, of course, that's often referred to as repetition without direct repetition. And then, as we know, white matter in the brain also develops during rest and recovery in the same way as muscle tissue. So, even at a very anecdotal level in conversation with coaches, I always stress that point. To what extent does the practice session that the athletes are engaging look like competition? To what extent is there some element of repetition? And to what extent is there some element of overload that challenges the system? I guess that is often referred to in the learning literature as the challenge point, which is the point at which the system is stressed that it has to grow from that particular process. They're quite important principles, I think, and those I think that coaches tend to resonate with.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to think of it. Yeah. And getting into a bit more specifics of a practice and training, I wanted to ask you a little bit about training perceptual cognitive skills like anticipation. And I know you've done a lot of work in this area, for example, the kind of temporal occlusion paradigm with tennis serves and things like that. I've talked a little bit about that on the podcast already, but can you maybe give us an update on some of the recent stuff you've done in this area?
Yeah, I guess I've been doing research for almost 30 years on this particular topic, actually. And again, that my motivation stemmed from some of my early interest and exposure to sport. I was a central defender in soccer, and I was always interested as to how skilled defenders would anticipate and read the game. So that actually sparked my interest in that area, and my undergraduate project, and then subsequently my PhD focused on that particular area. I also think there's a great realization amongst coaches that it's one of the most important aspects of the game. Certainly, a lot of team sports and racket sports. I think the ability to be able to anticipate and make the right decisions under pressure are obviously key components of those skills. I think we've gone a long way in regards to understanding the underlying processes and mechanisms that contribute to skilled anticipation in these time-constrained high-performance domains. We know, for instance, that experts are better at picking up postural cues. We know that they're better at recognizing patterns and familiarity in evolving sequences of play. We know, of course, that they use the visual system in a much more efficient and effective manner as determined by the research on gaze behavior. And we know that they're more accurate in regards to the use of probabilistic information in regards to what might happen next in these types of situations. And we know that all of these skills can now be measured either under reasonably controlled conditions in the laboratory or to a certain degree under more dynamic conditions in open play situations as well. I think that perhaps what we have less understanding of, and an area that we've been focusing on more so in the last 2 or 3 years, is the kind of interaction between what I might call sort of low-level cognitive processes and higher-level cognitive processes. So the low-level cognitive processes, in my mind, will be things like the pickup of biological motion, i.e. perceptual cues, whereas the more higher-level cognitive factors are things like the role of context in the anticipation and decision-making process. And the context, is a wide-ranging number of factors that might go from things like the score and the stage of the game to specific knowledge of an opponent or a team. And clearly these factors interact. So I think we need to know more about these higher-level cognitive factors and how they interact with these low-level cognitive factors. I guess the reality of the situation is that anticipation and decision-making in these types of environments is very dynamic. And all of these different perceptual cognitive skills interact dynamically, probably as a function of the numerous constraints in the situation, including, for instance, situation, tasks, the number of players involved, and a whole range of different factors. So I think we continue to try and make progress in regards to our understanding of how these perceptual cognitive skills are developed and how they impact on anticipation and decision-making. In regards to the training side of things, we've made great progress over a couple of decades in regards to the fact that certainly we can take isolated skills, like, for instance, the ability to pick up perceptual cognitive cues, postural cues, and to train people to pick up these cues better, which then facilitates anticipation. There's been lesser stuff on the training of pattern recognition and the use of situational probabilities, but there's some literature out there, all of which is generally supported. I suppose the interesting question is to what extent we can validly take an isolated perceptual cognitive skill like postural cue usage and train it, as opposed to which there may be much greater benefits in trying to train interaction between the perceptual cognitive skills in dynamic situations. Of course, the challenge there is one of measurement, both from a testing and a training perspective. Classically, we still employ a fairly reductionist approach to this process. So the notion of being able to measure and record numerous perceptual cognitive skills as they interact dynamically is quite difficult from a training and a testing perspective.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I definitely agree with your point about trying to combine the different cues for anticipation with the situational probabilities or context. And another thing I really like about that area of research and what you've done, I commend you for, is it's one of the very few areas where you're testing transfer to actual real play.
Yeah.
You've done actual on-court measurements of tennis playing after your training. So I think we need way more of that. I know. And like you said, it's difficult to do, especially if you're going to add in realistic game situations and things, but we definitely need more of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly on that front. But even then, to be fair, I guess our measures of transfer are somewhat limited. So, by way of example, for instance, if we develop a video-based training program to test perceptual cognitive skills, for instance, and then, as you suggest, the transfer test may then involve maybe measuring anticipation in an on-court situ, it's still a fairly isolated measure of transfer, because clearly it doesn't involve the use of context. It doesn't involve knowledge of the opponent, the stage of the game. So even our measures of transfer, while we have made significant progress in that regard, they're still probably a long way off what transfer would actually look like in a real game situation. On the positive side, though, I mean, technology is moving ahead apace. Clearly we've now got increasing access to things like 360-degree video, to virtual reality environments, and to more and more sophisticated equipment, which improves the process of measurement. So we are moving forward in our capacity and our capabilities to actually record performance in the actual performance setting as closely as possible. We've also actually, in addition to the more classical sort of simulation-based literature on the training side, I mean, we've also been doing quite a bit of work actually integrating some of the work that we've been doing on deliberate practice with the work on perceptual cognitive skills training. So, for me, interesting questions are, what kind of thought processes do elite athletes use before, during, and after match play and training to try and improve the process of decision making? Are they very self-reflective about what they did right, what they did wrong? And does this process of self-reflection or deliberate practice, if you like, then facilitate the knowledge base that would underpin the anticipation and decision making process? So there's lots of interesting work that could be done there, for instance, using video, prompted by instruction and feedback from a coach that would prompt processes of self-reflection and help develop those types of knowledge structures. So that's one approach that I think is probably under-researched, and there's relatively little empirical research, although oddly enough, probably a fair amount of anecdotal evidence for the value of that approach from the actual coaching or performance setting. And I guess we've also been trying to link our work on practice structure and design to the development of game intelligence skills. I mean, clearly one of the challenges of drill and grid-based practice sessions is that there may be limited opportunity for anticipation and decision-making. So we've been trying to actively encourage coaches to develop practice environments that are more realistic and they're more dynamic and that actually necessitate that athletes anticipate and make decisions during competition. And just to illustrate the extent of the problem, in some video-based time use analysis that we've done of coaching sessions in soccer, that's sort of fairly high-level clubs, both in England and in other parts of Europe, what we typically find actually is that only around 40 to 45% of practice time are actually players being asked to engage by the coaches in situations which require them to make strategic and tactical decisions. So going back to my analogy of developing the biceps before or developing neural networks in the brain, the interesting question is that the most efficient use of practice time for the development of game intelligence skills? And should we be therefore trying to improve the instructional systems design aspect of these training sessions so that more time the players are actually engaged in activities where they have to make decisions that are similar to those that they would make during match play. I think it's an interesting area for performance enhancement.
Moving from practice and development kind of side of things, I know you've done a lot of research and writing on the topic of talent identification, which is obviously a big one. Can you talk a little bit about that work and kind of how you think this is best achieved? I know that's a really big problem, but can you tell us kind of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it is a difficult one, isn't it? But talent identification remains an immensely popular area. I was very pleased the other day, actually. I wrote a review paper in 2000 in the Journal of Sports Sciences on perceptual cognitive skill implications for talent identification development. It's actually just reached 1,000 citations the other day, which I think reflects how popular that particular area is. I guess the challenge is that the coaches and the practitioners, they're all looking for some kind of silver bullet here in regards to the notion of, one test or measure, or at best even a collection of tests or measures that would be predictive to some degree of future performance levels in that sport. It's very, very difficult, particularly in sports like soccer and tennis and basketball, for instance, where there are so many different skills, attributes, components, characteristics, competencies, whatever you want to call them, that contribute to elite performance in that domain. And of course, all of those different subcomponents don't come together in the same way for each athlete. And whilst we may be able to identify minimum competencies, for instance, across these different areas, something that I've called the compensation phenomenon applies in the sense that, it doesn't necessarily mean that a weakness in one area can't be compensated for by a strength in another. So it becomes very difficult to deselect players based on performance on these types of multidisciplinary test batteries. I think the process is likely to be much easier in sports where maybe there are fewer of these competencies and characteristics. So I always refer to it as a cake, and I say fewer slices to the cake. Mm-hmm. And an example might be something like rowing, for instance, where it may well be that VO2 max is quite a large slice of the cake. Or in other words, there are a smaller number of these attributes or competencies or characteristics that contribute to the variance in performance. So it's certainly much easier in those types of sports. And of course, it's certainly much easier the shorter the period of time for which you are trying to make this prediction. So clearly trying to identify from groups of 6 to 8 year old soccer players, which of these players have the necessary characteristics to become elite at 18 years of age is much harder to looking at a group of 16-year-old players and deciding which ones should be selected for the under 18 age group. I think what we need, to be honest, is a greater emphasis on multidisciplinary approaches to this process. The research work that has tended to go on has tended to be fairly monodisciplinary in nature. Most of it has probably focused on measuring physical and physiological characteristics. But I think if we are to engage in this type of work, we need to use multidisciplinary test batteries that, in addition, also look at some of the psychological, the sociological, the tactical and the technical characteristics that contribute to the development of skill in that domain. And then whilst I think these types of test batteries may well differentiate between, as I said, players who are in an elite group and a sub-elite group, or those that might progress from one age group to the next age group, what we really need is more longitudinal research work where we can actually identify what is the predictive utility of these types of measures over time. And of course, how these measures may vary in importance over time. For instance, we don't know if a child does particularly well on tests of anticipation and decision making at age 8, whether he or she will continue to do well relative to the cohort on those types of measures at the age of 18, because there's been really no longitudinal data that has looked and addressed that particular issue. And it may well be, for instance, that the factors that may be used in these talent identification batteries to select players at an early age are the factors that discriminate players at a later age. So by way of example, for instance, we know that in soccer and a lot of other sports, there is a strong emphasis on selecting children who are physically and physiologically advanced at an early age. In other words, the biggest and strongest kids in the group. But we also know that later in development, when these players have been exposed to systematic training over a prolonged period of time, there are limited differences in physical and physiological attributes between adult senior players. So in other words, we may be deselecting players on attributes that may be important early on, but that aren't the determining factors later on. And it may well be that later on, for instance, some of the psychological factors or the technical and tactical factors are the factors most discriminate between groups. So whilst I do think there is a need for a lot more systematic research in this area, I guess I'm probably a bigger supporter and proponent of the process of talent development more than talent identification per se. And that largely reflects the inherent difficulties in the talent identification process.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And your point about doing the longitudinal investigations of the perceptual cognitive, I think is really interesting. I've seen some interesting stuff recently in video game research, which of course separates some of the perceptual cognitive from the physical. And they've shown kind of looking at how, when people first start a game, how well does it predict where they end? So it's kind of interesting. I know it's a totally different story, but I would like to see how that evolves. I don't think we have a good understanding. You're right.
I mean, I think that's an interesting concept overall, isn't it, Rob? And this kind of brings us back to the first question around the concept of deliberate practice. I do think that, arguably there could be some genetic influence on the effectiveness of practice here. So not everyone, in my opinion, not everyone who's exposed to 10,000 hours will be able to become an elite performer in that particular domain. But what we don't have, again, is research that looks at whether some athletes are more efficient in how they benefit from practice than others. So hypothetically, if you and I, for instance, both had 1,000 hours of practice on the development of a particular skill, would one of us learn more efficiently and effectively? And is that measure of learning efficiency that we take at that time, is it predictive of how we will continue to learn across the lifespan? I think it's an interesting area that has had relatively little focus on today.
I guess the last specific topic I wanted to ask you about, Mark, was I know when we were both still in England, you had this kind of really interesting project funded by the BBSRC to look at quiet eye in archers, right? Some really, really skilled archers. And I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about kind of what you found with that.
Yeah, I mean, progress on the project has been a little bit slower than we'd hoped. And there's a couple of papers that have been published out of it. The work that has been published to date has been mostly the behavioral aspect of the project. And there's a recent paper in experimental brain research, for instance, where we measured quiet eye in archers in the field setting, skilled and less skilled archers. And then what we tried to do was to create a computer-based simulation of the real-world archery task. And in that latter task, we again found some differences between skilled and less skilled archers, and also some differences in quiet eye, which reflected the differences that exist in the real-world situation. The reason for moving towards developing a computer simulation of the archery task was with the intention of then collecting data, fMRI data, in the scanner, try and get a better understanding of some of the neural processes involved in the quiet eye process. And whilst clearly there has been now a fairly substantive body of research that has demonstrated the strength of the quiet eye as an empirical phenomenon, unfortunately we still know relatively little or less than we should do about the underlying mechanisms involved in this particular process. So we have actually collected data in the scanner from skilled archers performing the task, and we are in the process of analyzing that particular data. So my hope is that it will be published probably sometime next year. So I haven't got any provisional findings to share with you at this time. But if all goes well and that's published, that will, I think, will be the first attempt, to my knowledge and understanding, to use fMRI to better understand some of the neural processes involved during the quiet eye period in an aiming task. So we're quite excited by that data, but alas, it's taken a little bit longer than we hoped for it to see the light of day. But hopefully we will get there in the not too distant future.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing that. And I guess the very last question I have for you, Mark, is Can you tell us a little bit about what you're currently working on or planning for the near future in terms of research?
Yeah, I mean, I've been here in Utah for about a year now, and we've just developed a new laboratory that will be opening. We're having an official opening sometime very early in the fall. I have a postdoc who's been with me for a year, Brad Forver, who joined me from Christian L's lab at the University of Florida. We've also just recruited Keith Lowes from Auburn University, who was previously a postdoc with Nikki Hodges up at UBC. And we've got 4 new PhD students starting this fall. And also, if anybody's interested, we're just about to advertise for another associate professor in this particular area. So we're beginning to develop a group with some critical mass. And my thanks to the University of Utah, we've had good investment in equipment and in lab space. So we're well set to move the agenda forward. We're still doing similar work around topics like anticipation and decision making. We've branched out slightly into different domains. There's a very exciting call out at the moment by the NIH to look at perceptual cognitive expertise in the detection and diagnosis of cancer from radiographic images. So we actually submitted an NIH grant a couple of months back. We keep our fingers crossed that something positive comes out from that. But nevertheless, we are doing some research work that kind of takes some of the methods and measures and frameworks that we've developed in the area of perceptual cognitive expertise in sport and trying to apply them to detection and diagnosis of cancer. So that's an interesting area for us, an interesting new area. But we're still doing some of the classical work on sport. And in more recent years, actually, I've also developed some slightly more clinical emphasis in areas like falls in the elderly. Again, taking methods of recording gaze data and looking at manipulations of stress and anxiety on perceptual cognitive and perceptual motor performance again. So we're still planning ahead also with that area of work. We've got good collaborations with the Department of Psychology here. And in regards to the previous projects on cancer diagnosis with the radio imaging department here in the hospital environment. So we've been developing good partnerships on campus, but I've also still been developing good partnerships external to the university, particularly with high-performance sport environments. And there is a strong push here at the moment at the University of Utah, actually, to try and set up a sports medicine and sports science institute, trying to leverage on some of the links that the university already has with the USOC and the Utah Jazz, with a view to creating a regional stroke national center that will focus on sports medicine and on high performance sport, which I guess maybe reflects the fact that I guess Utah and Salt Lake City and the surrounding areas, including Park City, is a big area for certainly the Winter Olympic sports, having previously hosted Winter Olympics in 2002 and having a desire to host a Winter Olympics in future as well. I think we're quite well placed to establish a major centre focusing on some of those issues. So again, it's early days, but we'll try and push that agenda forward and as usual, try and balance out our focus on work in high performance environments with some more recent emphasis in more clinical stroke health related work.
Yeah, that sounds great. And yes, I fully endorse your positions. As you know, I've been there, and you do have a beautiful setup and in a beautiful place. So anyone looking for a faculty position, you could do a heck of a lot worse. So, but anyways, Mark, I really enjoyed this, and so thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Oh, my pleasure, Rob. It's always great to talk to you, and well done with all of these different podcasts. I believe that they're proving to be very successful, very popular, and very useful for other faculty across the globe as they try and push forward, I guess, our agendas in these particular areas.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Mark. It's always great to catch up with you. You can find out more about Mark's work from the link in the show notes. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu and find out more about the podcast at perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Gone through St. Louis.